Hi, my name is Tracy Beller. My policy memo is specifically about the AIDS epidemic. And President Bush, who was a conservative president, during his presidency made a really strong statement in the face of HIV and its epidemic. During that statement, he said it is the stronger countries' responsibility to help the weaker countries. And so throughout the last several administrations, there's been specific resources and allocations and policies allocated to fighting the AIDS epidemic. And fortunately, in a lot of the regions and a lot of the countries that we have multilateral and bilateral negotiations with, the AIDS epidemic has seen a decrease. However, President Obama's administration looked at the funds being allocated and said we've spent $63 billion to date fighting this epidemic. And unfortunately, in some parts of the world, AIDS, there's a rise in deaths, there's a rise in new infections. And so there were 8 fast-track targeted countries. And with those countries, for this purposes of this memo, I actually chose 3, which were Kenya, Rwanda, and Malawi, and looked at those regions and looked at the literature available in those regions. And there are a mass increase of new infections and deaths in the last few years coming out of those countries. And some of the problems that I identified was all 3 of those regions are post-conflict regions. And they have a lot of refugees, a lot of resettlement camps in those areas. And everything ranged from gender violence all the way down to drug addiction. But one of the things that I did notice in the literature that was missing was the HIV has been studied and researched and grouped with specifically high-risk behaviors in a sexual aspect. But they haven't taken it one step further and coupled treating HIV with sex, but adding alcoholism and addiction treatment to it as well, and education. And so along with the rise in infections and deaths in these countries, there's also a huge alcohol problem. And specifically, one of the countries that I looked at had tried to, in 2013, implement a policy against alcohol, but the policy was very ineffective, and so the policy was retracted. The other 2 countries, there's no alcohol policy there. But one of the areas that they're really struggling in is that people want help, but there's no help to be given. And so a lot of the next step that I looked at was, are there existing facilities to help? One of the countries had 70 different treatment centers, but they only had 3 state-ran treatment centers, which made it almost impossible for the marginalized to be able to go into treatment. And so I identified an area that specifically needs help. And so when I started looking at the medical community, some of the medical research and the medical community that's treating and helping the doctors, the nurses, and the staff that are working in some of these HIV clinics within these countries, one of the things that was constantly said over and over again is they do not have time to do anything but what they do. And what they do is that they prevent, they maintain, and they educate about AIDS. But they don't have time for the alcoholic walking in the door. They don't have time for the person that's addicted walking in the door. And those high-risk behaviors that are identified with drinking and with addiction, they're just going left unnoticed and untreated, not unnoticed. As a matter of fact, my research revealed a doctor specifically stating that a little girl that was interviewed in one of the refugee camps stated that she saw, all she ever saw of adults was out being under the influence, being drunk. And so with that being said, one of the recommendations that I came up with in the policy is I did more research, as I thought, well, who in the globe, who in the world has been able to be experts in treating and fighting alcoholism and addiction? And that came up to be Iceland. And so what I recommend as policy recommendations is that some of our diplomats, that we organize some teams. And I thought it'd be interesting because our top treatment center in the country is actually Hazelden, who's recently merged with Betty Ford Clinic. And I thought it'd be interesting to put a team of people together to go into Iceland and look at those modalities. And then once those modalities are learned, to go back into the graduate school, hire people, and then go over into these 3 countries specifically and see if we can't start working towards treating some of the root causes of HIV infection.